Hi, everybody. Before we get started today, I just wanted you to meet Rusty and Dobson. I'm introducing you to them because undoubtedly at some point in this narrated PowerPoint, or maybe in others, you will hear them in the background. Rusty is the rust-colored dog on the left, and we've had him for about 3 years. They're both rescues that came from the Humane Society. They're both pit bulls. Dobson is older. He's about 9 years old. Rusty's about 4. And Dobson is probably the one you'll hear the most because he's fascinated by squirrels. He sits in windows and looks for them, and when he finds them, he lets out a very loud and sustained bark. So you are bound to hear him at some point. So I figured you'd see them before we get started. So there they are. So we are moving into chapter 10, which covers the Dada movement. Dada as an art movement is basically the years just in the middle of World War I and just after World War I. The different dates are slightly different between the three major centers of it. So we will look at the first manifestation of Dada in Zurich, which is in Switzerland, and then we'll move to New York City, and then specifically to Berlin after the war to look at how Dada manifested itself there. So these are the figure numbers that are related to these three particular places in Europe and the United States. And then this is followed by three objectives, things to think about as you listen to my narration and you read the textbook. Think about how Dada is a reaction to World War I, and really, what was World War I? How is it different than other conflicts that had existed in the past? How does it relate to modern life? How does it relate to the 20th century? These are all important questions. And then also, the next bullet point asks you to think about the differences in the three regions. And then I've listed three concepts that are linked to each of these locations. So the idea of chance and how chance might be related to art is something that is really important to Zurich. And then we'll move to New York, where the idea of the ready-made is important. Also the machine, I didn't write that down, but the machine throughout all these three places is really important because increasingly artists are critical of technology and critical of the machine especially. And then finally we'll look at photo montage and its political usage in Berlin. The major idea related to Dada is that it is anti-art. And so we'll be looking at different ways that these artists tried to create something that was not art, something that they called anti-art, and ask the question: is it art or is it not? And what is anti-art? So we will kind of grapple with that throughout the chapter as we look at different expressions of that. We've already seen how the war impacted other movements, so we talked about it with the Futurists, and we also talked about it with the German artists associated with the Blue Rider group. But to talk a little bit more specifically about World War I, it was this huge conflict between 1914 and 1918, which had devastating effects on Europe, particularly. It was a war between an alliance that consisted of France, Britain, Russia, and Serbia, and ultimately the United States, although the United States did not get actively involved and send troops until 1917, so just a year before the conflict ended. It did not impact the United States to the same degree that it would impact Europe, and so it's kind of quite different in the U.S. And then they were allied against the Central Axis that consisted of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was related to a number of issues that we won't really get into in this class, but as I've already mentioned before, it had a lot to do with kind of nationalism and a sense of righting wrongs from the past. There was a great eagerness for European nations to engage in a war because it had been some time since there was a major conflict, and Europe was used to these major conflicts. It had been a defining feature of life in Europe since the Middle Ages. So there was a general anticipation and almost a positive outlook on going to war at this point. But that was at the beginning. By the end, people realized that warfare in the 20th century was a completely different thing. And so you look at the death numbers, uh, and these are basically conservative estimates of the number of people killed. There were 10 million soldiers that died in World War One. And then the thing that was very unusual is that there were also 7 million civilians that were killed in the conflict. And this was something new. Usually, European wars took place on battlefields and they were contained in that way. And you didn't have all of these civilian casualties that were a byproduct of this war. But that was almost as many civilians died in this conflict, as did the soldiers. And so this is something new and impacts people in a great and profound way. And then the other important number to think about is the number of wounded. Over 20 million people were wounded in the war, both soldiers and civilians, and they survived. And the survival is something that is also related to the 20th century. The fact that medicine, the fact that surgery, the fact that people were able to stay alive longer and recover from things that would have been fatal even just 20 years earlier is something that became a legacy of World War One. It was referred to as the war to end all wars, although only 30 years later that expression would be untrue because the next one was even worse. But at the time, it was thought by the conclusion of this war that there could never be another war as disastrous and as horrific as this one had been. All kinds of new technology got rolled out as part of this effort, including airplanes, tanks, machine guns, flamethrowers, chemical weapons, and submarines, as I've had listed here as you see them. This was also the first war that was extensively documented through photography, for better or worse. So I've included a range of photographs here just to give you a visual of the war, starting with these soldiers who, at the beginning of the war in 1914, like I said, were looking forward to it, thinking that it would be a great way to prove their manhood and that, perhaps it would get them dates when they came back from the war, not realizing that most of them would not come back from the war. So here's some optimistic images to start us off. These are some paintings from the 19th century that undoubtedly people had in their heads when they went off to war. These ideas about heroism and about bravery and about being martyrs, perhaps, that would glorify their nation and glorify themselves. These are paintings that were done to valorize important men, whether it was Napoleon on the left or General Wolfe on the right. And these are the types of romantic images that do glorify this sense of warfare as a masculine endeavor. And it would not turn out to be this way for virtually anybody. Next several slides contain images related to the warfare and the conflict of World War One. So you can take a look at them. I've also included on the Canvas site some film clips that specifically deal with aspects of trench warfare. There's a clip from a 1978 film version of All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a book written by a German soldier that was probably the most intimate and really a horrifying depiction of the effect of the war on individuals who fought it that came out of the entire conflict. So there's a little clip there just to give you a sense of the battle and the experience of the men that went through that. So you can flip through these slides. My narration will pick up again at the slide labeled The Walking Dead. As already mentioned, the number of wounded who survived in World War I was unprecedented, and that's thanks to medical technology that developed. In fact, during the conflict, there was a new understanding of hygiene and of a development of antiseptics that allowed people to survive where they would have died earlier from infection. They mobilized hospital units so that they were on the front lines. The soldiers were treated right away, and that saved countless lives. And other types of procedures and understandings of how the body functions were so much more advanced in the 20th century than they had been before. Something like they developed a splint that allowed people with thigh injuries to survive. And we might not think of thighs being such a crucial part, but if you are injured in your thigh, you can lose a tremendous amount of blood if you don't immobilize it right away. And they understood that and learned that during World War I, so they developed a splint that allowed soldiers to survive this wound. Most tragic wounds were those that involved facial disfigurations, and the soldiers that survived these terrible wounds to go back home and were permanently marked by disfigurement. And this led to developments of whole new processes in plastic surgery, as well as in attempts to cover up these disfiguring scars and wounds that people would have for life. So we'll see a number of artists dealing with this idea of almost like the cyborg, people who are human and also part machine with their prosthetics uh, and with their facial disfigurations. The question of how human are we still becomes one that you'll see artists grappling with. Your textbook talks a little bit about this prosthetic revolution that occurred, and the latest edition of it actually includes a mention of a really interesting sculptor from the United States. Her name was Anna Coleman Ladd. She's not a Dada artist in any way. She was instead a traditional artist trained in sculpture in Boston, who left the United States and went to France and put her artistic abilities to the service of these soldiers who had these terribly disfiguring injuries. And what she did is she created masks that would be affixed to the faces of these individual soldiers, and she would match them. She would match them to their faces. She would take molds of their face, and then she would create these very thin. I believe they were made out of copper masks that could hide the wounds of these soldiers. She would paint the skin tone of the masks so that they were as close to the skin tones of the soldiers as she could. And here you see an image of her at work on one of her masks that's being worn by one of these soldiers. And then over on the right, you see a whole series of molds she has taken from the faces of soldiers that she's trying to help. So, not a Dada artist, but hats off to Anna Coleman Ladd for really putting her artistic skills to the betterment of these individual soldiers. The country of Switzerland was a neutral country during World War I, and it became the center for a group of individuals to gather, people who were intellectuals and poets and artists, musicians, who were really disgusted with the way that Europe had kind of fallen into what they thought of as almost a new barbarism. All of these ideas of civilization and modern life and ideas of progress that were associated with modernity all seem to have come to a sharp decline as people were beside themselves with the fact that Europe had once again opted to go the military. And so these people got together, they gathered in Zurich, and we'll talk about some of the individuals in a minute, but they came up with this name, and the name was Dada. And there are a variety of different sources for that name. On the right, you can see a label or an advertisement for a certain type of shampoo that was Dada shampoo. And this shampoo was obviously very effective, as you can tell by that woman's gorgeous hair. But it was also a nonsense word for them. It reminded them of a young toddler just beginning to speak, saying something like Dada. It also was a word that meant no, no. It was in French, it referred to a type of child's toy, the hobby horse, or a rocking horse that children played on. So this range of meanings, the fact that you couldn't specifically pin down Dada as meaning any one particular thing is what appealed to these artists and these thinkers when they came up with the label of Dada. Now, Dada itself was meant to be a performative and a group activity. And so you see that the image on the left is where these artists and intellectuals got together and they created a cafe where they would really kind of goad the public and do ludicrous, outrageous things that would cause the audience to question authority and question all types of things. One of the visual artists to emerge out of the Dada scene in Zurich was Jean Arp, and later he reflected on this time period, and this is what he said: revolted by the butchery of the World War, we in Zurich devoted ourselves to the arts. While guns rumbled in the distance, we sang, painted, made collages, and wrote poems with all our might. We were seeking an art to cure the madness of the age and find a new order of things that would restore the balance between heaven and hell. And that really was this idea that the world had gone mad, and so they were going to double down on this idea of madness, and they purposely sought art that was, or sought creation, I guess, more than art, that was a brand new form of expression. Two of the creators of the Dada movement were Hugo Ball and Tristan Tzara. Neither of these were visual artists. Hugo Ball was a poet, and Tristan Tzara was a writer, a philosopher, thinker, both of them were. And one of the things that was one of the ideas that was important to them was that Dada be something that wasn't just locally specific, but that Dada spread. So there was almost a proselytizing zeal in the case of Ball and Tzara, especially Tzara, who began to put together his own publications, magazines, to spread the word about Dada, about the ideas associated with Dada, about its stance against the mainstream and against all these things that had led to the World War that they were currently experiencing. One of the most important aspects of Dada as it manifested itself in Zurich is that it was profoundly performance-based. It drew on the inspiration of those futurist evenings that we talked about when we discussed the futurists. And together with Hugo Ball and Tristan Tzara, an assorted group of writers and performers gathered together. These included visual artists like Jean Arp and Sophie Tober and Marcel Janco, who we'll see, as well as Emmy Hennings, who she made puppets and she was a dancer. Sophie Tober was a dancer as well. And they would get on stage. First of all, they converted a cafe and they renamed it the Cafe Voltaire. And that was an ironic title because Voltaire is one of the philosophers of the Enlightenment. And they saw Europe in its current condition as anything but enlightened. So they saw it as really kind of destroying the whole myth of progress and the myth of enlightenment and the myth of people's lives getting better through things like education and the development of the material world. And so they would get up and they would spoof and ridicule and they would satirize current states of affairs. They would do ridiculous things. They would be dressed in outrageous outfits, as you can see from these two stills of these performers. Two of the most outrageous types of performances were those that were performed by Hugo Ball or others using his ideas of nonsense poetry is one. This is an image of Hugo Ball dressed in, again, a crazy costume, like a robot-like costume, and a copy of one of his poems known as Karawane. And he invented this language. It makes no sense. It's just sounds. Jolafanto bambla, o fale bambla, means nothing in any language. So it's nonsense poetry. There is no meaning, just as there is no meaning in life. We've destroyed any sense of meaning through the meaninglessness of war. He also invented this idea of chance poetry. So he would get words and cut them out of the newspaper, and then he would put them into a hat or a bag, and then he would draw them out by chance. It created the poem. So there was no preconceived idea of what the poem was going to be about. There was no narrative structure. It was just a poem that consisted of random words drawn from a bag. And again, because the war had destabilized everything that you knew about reality, there's a real link between this idea of chance, of there being nobody in control. There is no God, there is no country, there is no law that can make sense out of the current situation. And so this idea of chance poetry, or this idea of nonsense poetry, really becomes a symbol of the artists in Zurich and their frustration with systems of control, of ideas of authority in many ways. And tradition, especially tradition, this idea that they are striking out into brand new territory. One of the visual artists associated with the beginnings of Dada in Zurich was a man by the name of Marcel Janco, and he was somebody who was a cubist by training. This is an example of the type of paintings that he did. Even as he was in Zurich, he continued to be a cubist painter. So this one, you can see that it takes place in a cafe, and you've got people and tables and lots of activity. But this isn't really what characterizes Dada. This is a kind of a traditional cubist painting at this point in time. The thing that was Dada about Janco and his production of objects were more these masks. These were masks that he designed and he created that were meant to be worn on stage at the Café Voltaire by not only him, but the other performers and dancers and poets and musicians. And one of the things about the Café Voltaire is that these performers would be on stage, and oftentimes there'd be a number of them on stage, and they would all be doing different things. So one of them would be dancing in perhaps a costume designed by Marcel Janco and made by Janco and perhaps Emmy Hennings. And then another would be making some strident noises on an instrument, kind of like we saw with the futurists and their idea of futurist music. Somebody would be reciting nonsense poem, and there would be no narrative structure, so everything would be happening all at once. So anyway, these were masks that Janco made, and he made them out of throwaway material. He made them out of cardboard and cut up paper bags and bits of burlap sacks, and whatever materials he could find, he fashioned into these masks that were kind of human, and they were kind of monstrous. They were a combination of things, but they were really made out of trash, made out of things that people threw away. And so in itself, it's anti-art. It's a sculpture that's not a sculpture. It's like the experiments really that Picasso and Braque were doing earlier in the decade back in their studio. But these were meant to be worn and performed, and for people to almost feel disgust by. At the time that Janco made these masks, he may have been inspired by the types of gas masks that were standard issue for soldiers going into battle. So, for example, the images on the left of all these soldiers lined up with these things distorting their face, these exaggerated, disfiguring types of gear that could save your life, seem to have been an inspiration for some of his masks. Unfortunately, too, they kind of anticipate all of these figures that you see on the right, these soldiers and civilians who were severely disfigured by being in combat or being unfortunately drawn into combat, whose faces became monstrous by society standards. So even though Janko probably didn't see these types of disfigurements that you see here, his masks often seem to anticipate that with their sort of ghastly, monstrous features. Junko undoubtedly made dozens and dozens of these masks for these performances, but they weren't things that ultimately ended up being saved. And so now today, there's only probably about 10 or less than 10 that still exist from this period. But they were once crucial parts of creating this kind of theatrical vision of dysphoria, of kind of maybe apocalyptic visions almost. For my money, the greatest artist that emerged out of the Zurich Dada scene was Sophie Tober. Later, in 1922, she married Jean Arp, so she became Sophie Tober Arp, and that's what she's mostly known as today, so I'll refer to her as that. But during the period from 1915 to 1922, when she was in Zurich as part of this Dada scene, she was Sophie Tober, and she was single, and she is probably more than anybody responsible for this idea of understanding that anything can be art, that everything has the potential to be art in a way. She didn't see distinctions between different media. So for her, she was trained as a textile designer, and she also had training as a dancer. So she understood really how important it is for arts to be interchangeable and how they mix together. And so she designed costumes, and she made puppets, and she danced, and she made paintings, and she did sculpture, and she has this kind of zest for life that even though it's been 100 years since Sophie Tober was making work, you can almost just feel the curiosity that comes from her. So a great, interesting person in general. These two images depict her. On the left, she's shown wearing one of her costumes that she made out of cardboard that she wore at the Cafe Voltaire during one of her performances. The dances that she would perform at the Cafe Voltaire, even though she was trained as sort of a classical dancer, she did these herky-jerky movements. They were awkward. They were much more in line with what we think of as modern dance today. And she was doing it in 1915. She also constructed puppets. She constructed puppet sets. She did small little puppet shows. You can see her on the right with an assortment of her puppets behind her. She was simply just interested in expressing herself creatively. And I don't know that she ever thought of her art as anti-art. That's something that maybe Jean Arp thought more of his art was. Sophie Tober art, though, was really interested in just cutting the distinctions between ideas of what fine art is and what craft is, and what those distinctions had linked to them. On these two slides, we see on the left an example of Sophie Tober Arp's costume design. You see a photograph of Jean Arp, the man that would become her husband, and he is wearing on his face this mask that simply consists of just a disc cut out, but it really alters his appearance and alters his form in a very interesting way. And then on the right, you see Sophie Tober herself doing one of her kind of awkward, clunky dances. She's wearing a costume designed by Marcel Janco, and so that's one of his masks that no longer exists. And you can see those same kind of robot arms that were on Hugo Ball earlier when he was in that photograph of him doing his nonsense poems. So here she is in the midst of one of her awkward dances, clunky dances. Her best friend at the time was Emmy Hennings, who was there at the beginnings of Dada as well. She was also a performer, a dancer. She also designed puppets and dolls and costumes. Unfortunately, not a lot of her work has survived, so most of Emmy Hennings' objects that she created were destroyed. So there's not a lot to look at with her. other than these two photographs where you see her with a couple of her creations. Otherwise, she didn't really have a prolific visual arts career. She was more a performer, singer type of individual, not so much a visual artist. Here we see Hennings and Tober together on the left. They're wearing outfits that were designed and created by Sophie Tober. She was interested in cultures outside of Europe, part of that primitivism of early European modernism. In her case, she was fascinated by American Southwestern cultures. So the Hopi are a group of First Nations peoples who have a very sophisticated belief system linked to Kachina spirits who bring blessings to the humans. And this is an example of a Hopi Crow Mother, which is one of the Kachina spirits on the right. Fortunately, Sophie Tober's enthusiasm for them really led her to copying some Kachina imagery really quite directly. Today, this would be considered very inappropriate, culturally insensitive. I'm sure she didn't mean it at the time, but it's not cool to do, so don't do it if you want to. Here are two of Tober's creations. On the left, one of her puppets still survives. It's a puppet that is very robotic-like. It's got multiple heads and arms and legs. And then over on the right, you've got a historical photograph of one of her little small puppet theaters where she would put on these puppet shows at the Café Voltaire. You can see the background of these walls are covered in these paintings that she did herself, and then some of the puppets that inhabited that space. Her most well-known sculptures today consist of the series that she did of 5 different heads. They're just called heads. They are turned wood, and then she painted them or added other materials to them. They very much look like hat stands that you would find in a hat shop. And she liked that about them. She liked that they kind of looked like something every day, but then they were also these kind of takes on a contemporary bust form. In fact, she once joked that if you didn't like them as art, you could just use them as a hat stand. So she was really kind of iconoclastic in that sense of not having this idea that she was creating art, and art was something very important and different from everyday life. The idea that art could have a utilitarian function was perfectly fine with her. So she did the series of 5 heads. I've only got 4 of them here, but here are 2 of them. And here are 2 more. All very similar in idea and execution, but each slightly different, combining painting as well as additional objects that were placed onto the wooden sculpted forms. And here's an example of one of the things I just love about Sophie Tober. She created this painting on the left, and you can see clearly the resemblance with the head that she created, that she sculpted. She actually turned it, on a wood turner, and then painted it. And so both of them, you can see the words 1920, well, the date 1920, and Dada written on it. Very similar design aesthetic, similar feel to them. One is a painting, one is a sculpture. I love the title of the painting. The title is Dada Composition, but then in parentheses it is flat head. So you get this sense of kind of this head rolled out that she's just created. So it's sort of a wonderful kind of similarity, whether she's doing a flat painting or sculpting an object that just looks like an everyday hat stand. Still, she's giving kind of great artistic attention to both. And moving between materials is really one of the distinctive features of Sophie Tober. That's so wonderful, and today is so very contemporary. Contemporary artists today work in a variety of different materials and different mediums. They're painters and they're sculptors and they're installation artists. It's very rare that you find a contemporary artist that simply focuses on one mode of artistic production. But Sophie Tober was doing it in the 19 teens. So this is a great example. On the left, you've got a painting titled Dancer, and then on the right, you've got a weaving where she incorporates that same dancing figure into it, but then she adds other geometric abstract elements. You've got some like feathered serpent there, or birds intertwined in one of the panels. And Jean Arp, when he met her, she just expanded his world by her understanding that there are all these possible avenues for artistic expression. So here he says, it was Sophie who, by the example of her work and her life, showed me the right way. In her world, the high and the low, the light and the dark, the eternal, the ephemeral, they're all balanced in perfect equilibrium. And you really do get a great sense of that as you look at her work and examine how she was so interested in exploring ideas in a variety of different mediums. Tober was also a painter. She was interested in painting geometries and patterns and designs. She was interested in painting um, kind of meaningless abstraction. So her geometric abstraction doesn't have a meaning. It's based on her desire to create something that's beautiful to look at, that's pleasing to the eye. But unlike the other abstraction that we've looked at that references, ideas about mysticism or spirituality, in the case of Hilma af Klint or Kandinsky. Here, it's this idea that art can be pleasurable, that there is not meaning inherent in these designs, something that as a textile artist, she was discouraged from putting meaning into her designs that she wove or that she had planned for textiles to create, because that functioning of a textile was not, elevated like painting was. So she brings this real kind of utilitarian ideal to painting in an interesting way. A great example of this is this idea that she had of treating textiles like they were paintings. What you're looking at here is this textile by her on the um, right, and then a painting by her, geometric abstraction. She understood kind of the intrinsic similarities between a painting and between a textile. The idea of a grid, something we talked about with Cezanne, and this idea of dividing the space of a flat canvas into a gridded space in order to get a sense of a system. Well, intrinsically, making textiles is a gridded process. She did embroideries, she did needle points, she wove, she did a variety of different things. She was always working on something. So she understood that there's a grid inherent in both of these processes. She brings out the grid, she doesn't try to hide it. Textiles are always, not always, but they're pretty true to themselves. And she kind of makes paintings the same way. A couple more examples of textiles made by Sophie Tober, and this idea that a textile and a painting are similar. They're also both textiles, right? You paint on a canvas, and typically people consider textiles functional, but why do they have to be? So she creates these textiles that are meant to be hung on the wall, that are meant to be non-functional, that are meant to be decorative, or meant to function like a painting. So their function is that of a functionless thing, and all the contradictions inherent in that is something that Tober really would have loved. In the same way that she treated textiles as paintings, she also treated paintings as if they were textiles. Did I just say that right? I don't know what I just said, but there's great examples of her painting images like these, where the paint itself she really emphasizes the fact that it's like she's painting a textile. You see the ripples, you see the fact that it's not purely geometric. You see the wavy lines on the left, well, both on the left and the right. These are gouaches, they're paintings, but she emphasizes that the surface on which you find the painted images as if they're painted on a sheet that's hanging out to dry or something. It's not uniform, it's not crisp. There's a sense of movement and a real sense of vitality in paintings like this. Here, within kind of the same series of gouaches that she did, you've got that same concept at work of this piece of textile, this colored textile being a painting. It's interestingly self-referential in a trippy way. Over on the right, you've got again this gridded structure, but the grid is starting to break up, and you've got the fluidity and the movement inherent in all great textiles. Later, she would take this kind of visual aesthetic and apply it to sculpture. So she took these table saws and she cut out pieces of plywood and really kind of using the instruments or the tools for furniture making or for home construction and putting them again to artistic purposes. And she came up with these, again, meaningless sculptures that simply express design principles, and in this case, kind of a movement, kind of a unplanned arrangement of different materials. And you'll see that on the next slide as well. After the Dada period and after the war, she continued to make art until her death in 1940s when she accidentally died from a leaky stove, gas poisoning, unfortunately. But before that, not to be a bummer, she made these just amazing, beautiful designs, these great paintings. She continued to work in textile, doing these relief sculptures I was just showing you. Those come from a later point, the 1930s in her life. And she gets to this very clean design aesthetic, something very appealing in the cleanness of her lines and in the arrangement of these beautiful forms and different shapes. To us, they're almost like mid-century modern design because of the cleanness, the crispness, the linearity of it. Um, but again, this was before the mid-century when she was doing this. These are, again, almost play-like. There's a certain a joyfulness to paintings like this. Another artist associated with the Dada movement in Zurich is Jean Arp. Here you see him, like I showed you earlier, wearing a mask designed by Sophie Tober. And Sean Arp is associated with one of the most iconic images, artworks that come from the entire Dada period. And that's the work on the left. It's the one that's in your textbook. It's called Squares Arranged According to the Laws of Chance. And the story goes that Arp was working on a drawing in his studio and he was very frustrated. His hand wasn't doing what his mind wanted it to. It didn't look like what he had in mind when he set out to make this drawing. And so, in frustration, he tore it up and he threw it on the floor. And in the moment that the pieces of paper landed on the floor, he realized that these squares had arranged themselves in a way that appealed to him, that it accomplished what his rational mind couldn't accomplish. He found that the composition was appealing and balanced, and it's what he was trying to get to, but he couldn't. And so he began a period of experimentation where he would get pieces of paper, pieces of cardboard, and he would cut them or tear them. And again, he would just throw them up in the air, and then where they landed, he would basically glue them down. And so they're essentially collages. And he would make works of art in that way. This is very much in keeping with Hugo Ball's chance poetry. So it's chance drawing, it's chance compositions. And it became the spirit of Dada because, again, this idea of the world being so adrift, so without anything that you could count on. Nobody was paying attention to, the Ten Commandments, right? So this whole Judeo-Christian idea of morality has been tossed out the window in times of war. All these other things have fallen apart as well. So why not chance? Chance becomes the buzzword of the Dada movement in Zurich. It is what giving up control is like. And in this new world, it's kind of imperative to give up control. Control has not gotten us very into very good places. So the image on the left is the iconic one, the one that's so well known. But like I said, he did this several other times as well. Probably the colors aren't quite as appealing on the others. I don't know what the differences are really. At a certain point, he moved this idea from paper to wood. So on the left is one of his arrangements according to the laws of chance. And then on the right is these forms. He had somebody else actually cut out these biomorphic form. Biomorphic simply means curvilinear forms on a jigsaw. He painted them, and then he just kind of arranged them haphazardly without any plan in advance, just kind of free thinking, free associating, and he affixed them as they sort of lay, or as he arranged them without any prearranged plan. And then they were hung on the walls. So they're his versions of relief carvings. He called them concrete reliefs, although they're made out of wood. And they're actually quite beautiful. I would encourage everybody, now that we have nothing to do, maybe go out and play in the woodshed and make some of these beautiful forms, and then paint them, and then arrange them and hang them on the wall, and see what they look like. These are objects that are not meant to be any natural forms. They're not meant to represent anything. They have no meaning. Again, this idea of meaninglessness is something that he learned from Sophie Tober Arp, this idea of kind of just the object for itself, needing no justification. So he does a number of these, actually. And another important part of this idea of these objects that he made is having somebody else cut the images so that it wasn't him being in control. That's another way he got beyond the idea of the artist being in control. So he was just provided with these forms, and then it was his spontaneous arrangement that created the art of it. Some of them are obviously more successful than others. Some of them just look better. As art does. After the Dada years were over for Jean Arp, he kind of continued in this sculptural vein more than in a painterly vein, and he is most known for the work that he did after the Dada years as a sculptor, and particularly a sculptor of marble. So he moved from these wood pieces done on a jigsaw, like you see on the left, to carving these beautiful, soft, sensual forms. They almost look like human bodies, but they're not quite human bodies. They're done in the traditional media of marble sculpture, hearkening back to the Greeks and the Romans and ancient civilizations. And so they're traditional in that way, but they're kind of just lyrically beautiful and just very lovely. They come in a variety of different sizes. Some are more small tabletop-like sculptures. Others are large and monumental, bigger than life size. And you'll often find these in major museums around the world. You'll see a lot of these late Jean Arp kind of beautiful, beautiful things. Aren't they nice? They're kind of like blobs, or like a lava lamp. You know what I mean? Like, kind of blobby. And here's just a couple last ones. It's kind of like soft serve ice cream, maybe. Or maybe the one on the right kind of looks like that poop emoji. Maybe just a little bit. I don't know. Okay. There's another Swiss artist who visited Zurich and was friends with several members of the Dada kind of group there, but he's not really considered Dada, and his name's Paul Klee. He doesn't really fit into any category, and so this is really the only place I ever stick him, is just kind of at the end of the Zurich Dada, because he is Swiss. He made a series of about 50 great hand puppets. He didn't actually consider them part of his normal artistic production. He made them for his son. But today they're really considered some of the greatest things he made. Perhaps he was inspired by Sophie Tober or Emmy Hennings, or the puppet shows associated with the Café Voltaire. I don't quite know about that specific of a connection, but he would put on puppet shows for his son and create characters based on Swiss folk tales from medieval times and things like that. So here's just a random sampling of them here in the next couple slides, just to give you a look at some of these really cool things. Although not really associated with any movement, Paul Klee is a relatively interesting painter. He was inspired by childhood and children's drawings, and a sense of wonder kind of permeates his paintings. And he became very well known and quite popular, one of the more popular artists of the 20th century, painting scenes like these.